everyone. We're very excited at Berlin Memorial School to be able to be witness to the planting of some American chestnut seedlings. We have some distinguished guests, starting with members of the Conservation Commission from Berlin, members of the American Chestnut Foundation from Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And I would like to turn the program over to Mr. Walter Bickford from the Berlin Conservation Commission.
Thank you, Ms. Rosso. Well, thank you for all coming today. We've got a good day so far. It looks a little dark coming off there, but I think we'll be all right. We have two reasons for being here today. Number one, as Mrs. Rosso said, we want to plant some chestnut trees. And the significance of that, and it's very important, will be told to you by Mr. Van Boysant and the other people from the foundation a little bit later. But before I introduce them, I just want to let you kids know a little bit about forest cover and what the environment was like in Massachusetts. Before I do that, let me just introduce a couple of people on the Conservation Commission. Over there in the blue jacket is Skip Duggan. He's the chairman of the Conservation Commission. And Louise Jonder is behind me here. I'm Walter Bickford, longtime member of the Conservation Commission. What we try to do is protect land. We protected over 500 acres of land, so you kids can hike and get around the woods and we can see some wildlife in this town. Anyway, when I was a kid, just to give you an idea what forest cover was like, there was probably only a little over half the amount of woods that you see here today. I live 1 mile down South Street, and the lady across the street from me, where you know where Mockingbird Music is,
yeah.
And the Nelsons, well, his grandmother Marjorie used to tell me how she could stand on her front lawn in the early 1940s and see the church up here because there were no trees. It was all open field. And all these stone walls you see in the woods around there, that was to hold in livestock who were grazing in the fields. So there was a lot less woodlands and a lot more fields and open land in that time. In fact, way back in the 1840s, about 80% of this state was denuded of trees. There were no trees. And then they built the Erie Canal and people started going to Ohio where the farming was better and Massachusetts started to grow back. So the forest changes in species and makeup, and over time periods things change. But there are two other changes that I want to tell you about very briefly, and these are a little more insidious and not so good. One is the so-called invasive species, and the other one is disease that are hitting our trees. The invasive species is a very serious problem. I don't know if we can change it around now, but things like the Japanese bittersweet, the glossy buckthorn from Europe, and other invasive trees are taking over a lot of our native wood species, and it's changing the system quite a bit. You've all seen these vines crawling over trees and smothering them and breaking them. That's the Japanese bittersweet, and it's oriental bittersweet, and it's a very serious problem. The pretty roses you'll see all through the fields in another month, that's a multifloral rose, a very serious, very aggressive, invasive species, crowding out other species. The last thing I just want to bring to your attention is the whole issue of disease and insects that are killing off our native trees. When I was your age, we had American elm trees all over the place. Up in the center of town, these huge trees go up like vases. The roads were shaded. South Berlin, there were beautiful elm trees. And then the Dutch elm disease was introduced from Europe and killed them all. You people would be lucky if you see an elm tree more than a foot in diameter today, and then it won't live long. We have what's called the emerald bark borer, which is killing off our ash trees at this time. But anyway, one of the most serious environmental problems that ever hit the East Coast was the so-called Chestnut Blight. And I'm going to introduce someone right now from the foundation to talk to you about that whole notion and why they're here and how we're trying to restore that. So Mr. Rufen Van Boysant is a member of the American Chestnut Foundation. He has a couple of other people with him from the foundation who he will introduce and talk about the planting of the chestnut trees at this time. So thank you for your attention and hope you enjoy it.
Hi everyone. I first heard about the American chestnut tree and the blight when I was probably about your age, when I was at a summer camp where I grew up in New Jersey. And then when I got a little older, I went off to Rutgers University in New Jersey, and I got a degree in forestry. And I studied more at that time about American elm trees and the American chestnut. The American chestnut tree was a very common tree throughout the eastern United States, and it was used for timber for building barns and houses and fencing, and the chestnuts were used as a food source by a lot of wildlife, bear and wild turkey and deer, squirrels, chipmunks. A lot of things depended on the chestnut for food, and people use chestnut for food also. Chestnuts roasting on an open fire. You may have heard the song, but just after 1900, they started noticing that chestnut trees were dying down in the Bronx, New York area. And it turned out there was a disease called Chestnut Blight that came in from either China or Japan in the late 1890s. And it eventually killed, after about 50 years, all of the mature trees from central Maine all the way down to northern Georgia and Alabama. And it was a major loss for wildlife food and for the tree, the values of timber. An attempt was made to conquer the disease by the United States Forest Service, but it didn't work out. And in 1983, a group got together and formed the American Chestnut Foundation to do some crossbreeding. And the Chinese chestnut has a high degree of resistance to the blight, and the procedures that have been used, they cross-pollinated, they crossed an American chestnut with a Chinese chestnut, and then tested to see which trees had the best resistance to the blight. And they picked those and they used those to breed to another generation of American chestnut. And we've done that now for 6 generations, and we're producing trees, nuts and trees that we believe will be resistant to the disease. And these are some of the earliest ones that we have produced. And we'll plant 3 of them here today. I helped plant 5 in Woods Hole on Cape Cod 2 days ago. And so that's why we're here, to plant the trees, and hopefully they'll thrive and grow and produce nuts. And the squirrels and blue jays will carry the nuts out. They actually plant them in the forest for food for the winter, but they lose some of them, and they grow and become trees in time. And we've got a number of displays here, including a piece of chestnut tree that we found down in New Bedford that grew fairly large. And it was at a school in a nature study class at the vocational technical school. Found burrs on the ground, and they investigated to see what they were, and they found out they were from chestnuts. And we were able to pollinate the tree and secure chestnuts to plant. But the tree was subsequently cut down because it was located where the school, an expansion of the school, was taking place. But this is one of the larger ones that we've been able to find, and this is an example of the chestnut blight. It gets into the bark, and it will encircle the stem, and it kills off the portion above that, and then it resprouts from near the roots, and will grow for a while, and then get the blight, die back, and then it'll resprout again. And these are samples, and the blight spores get in where there's some injury, and you can see here there was some injury from a grass mowing, and blight got in, and it turns orange in color where the disease is. And this is another one that I cut just a couple days ago, and again you can see the blight starting here. So besides myself, we have Elizabeth Hammond here, and Kathy Desjardins, who are also members of the Chestnut Foundation. So I'll let Elizabeth say a few words at this point.
I'm coming from a different perspective. I actually work for the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture seasonally as a plant inspector, and I had to identify diseases and insects that would impact our nursery stock. So I feel one reason I like to be involved in this organization is to be a little bit responsible for some things that we unintentionally brought from Japan and China through our nursery stock. And there is on the website a list of all the invasive species that are now regulated by the state, and you can find all of the things that Rufin talked about as well as many more. And this is exciting, this project, because we're having some success. Maybe 1/3 of the population of this generation will be resistant to the blight. And in the future, maybe 35 or 40 years, we might be able to reintroduce these resistant trees that have maybe 95, 96% American characteristics back into the forest and get the habitat and food for the wildlife and humans again. So here on the table, when you have time to take a look, there are different examples of nuts, so you can tell the difference between a chinkapin, American chestnut, and a Chinese chestnut. And you can look at the leaves and see how they're different. American chestnut leaf looks a lot like a canoe, and it has these cool teeth with back curving little spiral things. And the Chinese chestnut is more oval in shape. And although it's resistant to the blight, we like the American characteristics better because this is a Chinese chestnut. It's more oval and it doesn't have those curvy things on its leaf margin. Because the American chestnut grows very tall and straight and is great for timber trees, for fence posts and telephone poles and furniture and lath and house framing. So, and these are the flowers. There are male and female flowers, and actually I think Kathy would be able to explain this to you, and we'll give her some time here. The female flowers look like a little pineapple, and the male flowers are quite showy and white and fragrant. So hopefully you will be able to identify these American chestnuts in your forest when you take hikes. So I'd like to introduce you to Kathy Desjardins, and she can tell you some more.
Hello, my name is Kathy, and I serve as the secretary for our Massachusetts Rhode Island chapter. I'd invite any of you to become members and learn a little bit more about the chestnut. As a member, you will receive mailings, and you'll learn about how we're advancing and how these trees that we plant are resisting the blight. If you have any questions and you come up and want to view the things that we've brought, feel free to ask me questions and I'll give you the best answer that I have. Thank you.
And we're going to do some planting, so why don't we plant it? And this is a this is a seedling that's 2 years old, and its background, it's 1/16 Chinese and 15/16 American, so it's not quite pure American, but it's getting very close. And this is a generation that we hope will have at least 1/3 of the trees have strong resistance to the blight. So we'll plant the trees in the hole here, and let me see how deep we are. And I'll put a little soil back in.
Squirrels actually plant American chestnuts 1 inch down. And they have a very long taproot, so that makes them more stable in the wind, plus the fact of having neighbors.
And this is some soil that I have mixed up, so would someone like to help plant the first one? Okay. I'll take the plant out of the tube. Hopefully it will come out. And I'll plant, put it in. If you can take some of the soil, put some of this around, fill in the hole. That's good.
Actually, chestnut deer don't add to chestnut.
Maybe you can just tip the, yeah, that's it, just. Okay, maybe put a little of the other soil back on the top.
It's probably 2 years old.
Okay, and then everything likes to eat chestnuts, and they also, the deer like to eat the chestnut seedlings. So we put a shelter to protect the seedlings, and hopefully the deer will wait until we're further along with our program, and then they'll have plenty of chestnuts to eat. So this goes over the, yeah, maybe you can, that's it, put the, yeah, they want to come through. Good, we'll do it like that, and then this, put this in if I can. There it goes.
We got this
That'll hold it in place. But with these loops, if you have to, if weeds or grass grow there, this can be lifted up and the other plants removed. And then we'll put mulch. We have a bag of mulch, and we'll put that down to keep the grass from becoming too aggressive. So we've got one, and we've got 2 more that are over here. I don't know how your time is. Do we have
7 more minutes.
a few more minutes?
7 more.
Okay.
Do another one, Rupert?
Yeah, why don't we
Okay, what do I need to carry? Shovel?
shovel? Oh, and I have, this is a tag that has the, tells what parents this came
Nice to
from.
meet you.
So as you can all watch this grow, you can see how tall you are now compared to the tree, and as the tree grows and you grow, you're going to grow up together. So keep an eye on it.
And are these about 2 years old or something?
So Rupert, how many years now? When did you first form 83? 83. So we're going on 30 years that this foundation has been working with these seedlings and cross-pollinating them with the Japanese tree and working out, trying to get a seedling in a tree that resists that blight. And so it is. It's 1/16 Japanese and 15/6 Chinese and 1/15
And
15/16 American. Yeah.
Right.
Good.
And we'll put some mulch around this, and we have one more tree. Do you have any more time? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, if you actually go back, aren't the Chinese and the American would have been the same back?
Oh, no,
Yeah, before the plate. Give me the shovel.
under, I'll do the green color.
Yes.
Everything I plant gets, they don't want me touching it. I plant strawberries, tomatoes, they get some sort of...
Want it deeper?
Yeah, and I'll just break up these
Now,
clods.
could you tell us while you're digging there how you planted the seedlings and how you take care of them until it's time to plant?
Okay, these nuts came from, the Chestnut Foundation has 4 research farms in Virginia. And we have the trees there that are only 1/16 Chinese and 15/16 American. And we got pollen, and you probably know what pollen is. It comes to help produce seed. And we find a few American chestnuts that are large enough that they have flowers. And there aren't very many because most don't survive long enough to flower. But we find some that are flowering, and we put the pollen from the research farm on the female flower, and then burrs develop. There's a sample of burrs over there. They're very spiny, and in October we harvest the burrs and get the nuts out. We store them in the refrigerator over the winter, just above freezing, and then in the spring we plant them out. And this is 1 year's growth from last year, and the nut, so it was 2011, and the nut was from 2010. And plant them in these pots, and I've got cages, wire cages that I keep them in, because the squirrels and chipmunks like to grab the nuts for food. And so to protect them from those critters, we grow them in a cage. And then when we plant them out, we use this hardware cloth wire to protect them further from rabbits and mice and other animals that would try and eat the eat the foliage, or even eat the rabbits will chew the small seedling right down.
So is there anything special that we should do to help them grow?
If it gets very dry, usually the first year they're fairly sensitive to being dry, and this looks like a fairly moist site here.
Right.
But if during the summer there's no rain for a week or 10 days, then it would help to give them some water. This mix of soil is not holding together as good as the last one. Okay, we need some soil around it.
At different places, the first place that we planted was Sturbridge Village. The number of seedlings we have are very limited at this stage of crossing. So we select sites where we know that they'll be taken care of and protected. And
That's it. A little more on this side. Well, just the way I did when I learned about chestnuts and the chestnut blight, is that as I got older, I started working to help the chestnuts, and now that you folks have learned about chestnut, hopefully some of you will work to help restore the chestnut as you get a little older. But we appreciate your coming out and helping us and learning about the chestnut blight and how we can help nature along by working.
We're excited to be part of this opportunity.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for
Thanks a lot, kids.
Okay.
coming out.
You have any questions? Come on, you gotta have a question.
How tall do they grow?
That's a good question. How tall do they
Okay,
grow?
Wheeler, you asked a question. How tall do they grow?
How tall do they
See,
grow?
she got a question.
Oh, they grow about 80 or 90 or maybe even 100 feet when they mature. The largest chestnut ever found in the United States was down in the southern part of the country, down in North Carolina, and it was 17 feet in diameter. And people called it the redwood of the East because they were so large. And I'm 6 foot tall, and you can imagine, you know, that's almost like 3 times my height that that tree was in diameter. Just a huge, they got to be huge, huge trees. And the Native Americans used chestnut to make canoes. It was a wood that they could easily work, and it was lighter than oak, and they found canoes in Lake Quinsigamon in the Worcester area. People diving found a couple of canoes that were made by the American Indian natives, and they were made from American chestnut. So even the Indians used the nuts themselves as a food source. So, very important tree, and we hope eventually we'll get it back in the forest.
Oh, you know, I'd like to mention something. Do any of you guys use computers? Yeah, I bet you all do. Huh? Something you might find interesting is to search online for Charlie Chestnut. There's a website that our foundation has called charliechestnut.org, and it will walk you through all the different aspects of growing chestnuts. So it starts with Charlie the Chestnut. He tells the story of the American chestnut. So check that out.
And there's a lot of information. We have a website, and with the 2 journals that will give you, the website is on there, and you can give it to the students, and they could do some more research online.
What are the websites?
It's acf.org. acf.org is the website.
Someone might want to ask about the history of chestnuts here in Berlin, because chestnut trees, there were a lot of chestnut trees that were growing here, and how they were used.
Well, I can remember being, when I was as young as these kids, it was still fence posts. One thing about it is very, very resistant to decay. In other words, you lay a piece of oak or pine or everything on the ground, and several years later you come back, it's gone, just rots away. A chestnut would still be there. There were fence posts in the ground when I was your age that were put in the probably before 1920. So they were over 25, 30 years old, and they lasted there up into the 60s that I could still see them. So that's how long a chestnut post was.